Hi everyone, hopefully you've all managed to get into the room okay now. I'm sorry we're a couple of minutes late. We do have a speaker missing at the moment who's not joined us just yet, so we thought we'd make a start and then Helen can join us as and when she can. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name's Lucy Truman. I'm the Managing Director of Truman Change, and I just thought I'd give you a little bit of introduction of what we're trying to achieve today, and then introduce you to our fabulous speakers who we've got today, who are going to be talking to us about communications during COVID. So I am on a bit of a mission, really. I think that we have spent many years accepting that change takes a long time to happen, and in recent months we have proven that it can happen extremely quickly. Everyone has gone through significant change in recent weeks, and what we do know is there's more to come because change is constant and things certainly haven't settled down yet. And whether people are driving change or they're experiencing change, it does have quite a profound effect on all of us. So I wanted to run a series of conversations really to explore that and see what we could learn about it, which we ran earlier in the year. But there were certain things that when we talked about, it didn't matter what theme we were talking about, there were certain things that just kept coming up time and time again. And one of those things was communication. So organisations that have done well during COVID and managed to repivot and completely respond quickly and change the way they work, often they talked about the importance of really good communication. So we thought there's definitely something worth exploring a little bit further there. So the format of today, it is a very informal session, and we've got 3 speakers, hopefully 4, one joining us, where we're going to just talk about, the speakers are all professionals in the field of communications and engagement, and both internal and external. So we just want to sort of learn from each other, really. We are asking everybody to stay muted just so we don't get background noise, but if you do have a question, dump it into the chat function and we can ask that. And we have got some questions which some people have submitted as part of booking to come on today, so we will talk about those as well. We are recording the session because we do put them on YouTube as a podcast, but it's only the sound recording, it's not visual, so don't worry too much about what you look like. And as always with Zoom calls, most of us are at home. I have a kitten right beside me that will probably show up at some point, but we're all kind of used to that by now, I think. So huge thanks to our speakers. So we have a great panel for you today. We have Paul Masterman, who is a Specialist Communications Associate and Consultant. Paul's been an interim in this field for a number of years and has worked with lots of different organisations around strategy, around their communications, both internal and external, so he'll have lots of wisdom to share with us, I'm sure. We have Ben Greenwood, who is a Deputy Head of Communications at Blackburn with Darwin. Now, full disclosure, Ben is my cousin, so this is a little bit of a family business situation at the moment. Despite the fact that both of us have worked in local government for years, this is the first time we've ever worked together, so that's very nice. I'm also a resident of Blackburn with Darwin and have seen firsthand some of their challenges, specifically around having additional restrictions. They were one of the first areas in the country to suffer from a local lockdown, and what impacts that's had on the community. So I'm sure that'll be a really interesting conversation. We also have Georgia Turner, who is the Head of Communications and Marketing from BCP Council. And BCP is Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, and is actually a new council, so was less than a year old when we went into lockdown. And it's basically been a new council set up, bringing together 3 other councils. So a workforce there that have already gone through quite a significant change, then being thrown into COVID land. So lots of challenges there, and also being a seaside resort, I'm sure you've had some challenges with people descending upon your areas once people were allowed to do so. And our final speaker is Helen Furnival, who I don't think is on the call just yet, but hopefully, oh, she's in the waiting room. I'll just let her join before I give her the introduction. There's always a little bit of a delay, isn't there? But Helen Furnival is the Managing Director of High Rise Communications. So she owns a PR company, which I'm sure she'll have some very interesting perspectives on. There's been lots of sort of interesting PR stories over recent weeks, not least the most recent being Dettol yesterday, trying to make us all feel warm and fuzzy about going back to work. So Helen may have some opinions on that. But recently, Helen has been supporting Ashgate Hospice Care during COVID and has previously worked for Red Cross. So he's well used to being in the kind of crisis mode situation. So huge thanks to our speakers for making time to share their stories with us today. So Ben, seeing as you are family, do you mind going first with just explaining a little bit about what it's been like working in communications during COVID for you and your team?
Thank you, Lucy. Well, it's been crazy, absolutely crazy. I mean, normally in a crisis, you have an intense period, 1 week, 2 weeks, a month. Then you move on to the recovery phase, so it gets a little less relentless. But it's been relentless when we became an intervention area, it posed real problems for communications. Just to explain what an area of intervention is, it's when your number of cases spikes to a place where the government comes in and intervenes. So you get additional measures and restrictions. So when Blackburn first became an intervention area, we weren't allowed to open gyms, beauty salons, etc. While nationally they were. And this poses often complex and some cases challenges, because you have to make sense to staff, our members and residents, what this is all about. So for example, in the protection area, because we've now gone to a very local lockdown where 8 wards in our area have got these restrictions and the rest of them don't. So in the restriction area, we've got gyms that are not allowed to open, but in the rest of the borough they are. But residents, and this is the crazy situation and where we get a lot of stick from businesses, and you can understand it, have this crazy situation where residents can't go into a gym on their street, but they can go to and travel elsewhere. So how have we dealt with it? Well, we've always had a plan, but the plan has always changed constantly because it's so fast moving, and because we often find the relationship with governments difficult because of the way they operate. So you'd remember when the Northwest or the Greater Manchester and the Bradford and Blackburn, Darwen, Pennine, Lancashire went into further restrictions. It was announced on Twitter at 10 o'clock. So you can imagine, what our staff, our members and our residents were thinking. Why haven't you kept us informed? It was also the night of Eid as well. So you can imagine our residents, because we've got a high proportion of BME in our borough, you can imagine how they were feeling. It was like bringing on restrictions where you can't meet with other members of your family who are not in your household on Christmas Eve, being announced on Christmas Eve. So the plan often had to change, but we've always prided ourselves on having plans linked to our strategic objectives and being based on data and intel. Obviously, we've gone to very targeted comms now because it's a very local lockdown. You need to speak to even down to communicating with people on the street, and we've had to get even closer to those communities and understand them. So that's been one positive, that we've actually become, even though local authorities are local leaders and they understand the communities, we've had to even understand them anymore. So I'm going to finish on just highlighting some things we've relearned as a comms team. We've always tried to keep calm. So when everyone's losing their head, what we need to do is put our foot on the ball, so to speak, and always have a plan, even when it's very difficult, when government change their mind in literally minutes. We've been very focused on data. I mean, that's been difficult as well, because the data we needed wasn't available at the start, especially in the when we became an area of intervention. Evaluate what you're doing always, because you need to know your comms is hitting where it needs to be. And partnerships also, they sometimes get overlooked when we talk about organisations and how they communicate. You know, the council has not been able to do their own. We've got great partners with our community, NHS, etc. And trying to keep your staff informed, which, as I said, it has been really, really difficult. I mean, councils, because of the austerity programme, have gone through 10 years of change, but we've seen that things have changed in minutes during the COVID crisis, and keeping staff informed has been really, really difficult. We operate a no surprise policy. We don't want our staff reading something in the newspaper that we are developing as policy. But how can you do that when, as I say, things change in literally minutes? And, you know, the final point, we've always tried to be transparent, open, and have human empathy. It's been really, really difficult. I mean, our shielders have been not able to see people for 6 weeks. They haven't even been able to go out of the house. So you've got to be really empathetic in your comms as well, and trying to keep it simple. So I wanted to do a very, very brief overview, and that's where we are in Blackburn with Darwin at the moment.
Thank you, Ben. Georgia, do you want to tell us a little bit about what's been going on for you in BCP Council?
Yeah, I can do. Thanks, Lucy. Completely agree with Ben's opening word, crazy. Absolutely. Probably one of the things that's people will know Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole for is what we call Beachgate. We've been in the news a lot during COVID because of what we've called, really, it was being a perfect storm that was brewing. We had, you know, people were off work, we were still in lockdown. It was hot. It was really nice weather. The kids were off school. Loads of people were furloughed, but they still had money in their pockets. We were in lockdown, but then Dominic Cummings happened, and people thought, well, you know, we know lockdown's being lifted in next week. Whatever. We're going to go now. We want to get out. We're fed up. Lockdown lifting's coming. We're going to the beach. We had people coming from miles, as far away as, you know, Birmingham, Derby. Day trippers. We hadn't got our infrastructure ready like we would normally have, because, as you can imagine, we have a huge seasonal workforce to keep our beaches looking as they do, patrol our seafront, keep people safe. That recruitment process normally takes place in the last 2 weeks in March. So whilst it had started again in anticipation of lockdown being lifted, we absolutely weren't up to full capacity. So we had things like, you know, all our toilets weren't open. It might be 2 or 3 miles between a block, or a couple of miles between a toilet block being open. And obviously they're not open as frequent, as long, because you have to shut them for protracted periods of time for cleaning, extended cleaning and the like. So, you know, we literally had hundreds of thousands of people coming down to our beaches. Traffic was gridlocked. And the response of local people was, you know, people are very protective of the local beaches. It's one of the reasons people choose to live here, because it's a really lovely environment. It's a great place to be. And so it was quite one of the comms challenges, I think, was explaining to people what we could and couldn't do to deal with the situation. So, for example, we couldn't at that point stop people coming to Dorset or stop people coming into our area, because the travel restrictions had lifted. So people were allowed to travel. We couldn't stop them doing that. We couldn't close the beach. We don't have powers to shut a beach. We can't fine people for social distancing or failing to social distance, because it's not law. It's just advice. We could have not opened our car parks, but we, you know, realistically, if you're on a day trip from Winchester or Birmingham or Bristol to the beach, you're not going to look at your local council, the local council's website before you leave to see if there's any car parking space. It's just not going to happen. So that was a real challenge, and we put a lot of work in to explaining that. Lots of Twitter threads, lots of social media, lots of resident emails. And another challenge was making sure we were seen to be treating our residents in the same way as our visitors. So where we're saying, you know, if it's too busy, go home. You know, don't you know, think about not going to don't go to the beach today. They wanted us to see that on our visitor and our destinations channels. They didn't want to see beautiful images of the beach being put out on our marketing, our destination marketing channel. So we had to make sure that we were consistent, because otherwise people were getting really, really understandably upset, saying, well, you're telling us to stay at home, we live here. What about all the people, descending on our beaches? So it was a challenge, and we saw some really quite horrendous behaviours. Where toilets weren't open, people were still going to the toilets. We've got 4,000 beach huts. There's about a metre behind the beach huts, so you can imagine the state of those. Camping, we've never had. You get the occasional camper on our beach. We were having 200 or 300 campers overnight on our beaches. You can ask them to move on, but do you mind going home, please? It's not. You can imagine how effective that is when people have come down, pitched up. They probably had a drink anyway, so they can't drive home. Can't drive home safely. So there was a lot of work went in after that first time, because it didn't happen once; it happened 2 or 3 times. Where we worked more with partners, so we very quickly put in place tow-away zones, which we didn't have before. We very quickly redeployed our community safety accredited scheme advisors, so they've got more powers in terms of enforcement over and above what our seafront rangers have got. We accelerated our recruitment for our beach rangers. So we moved as quickly as we could, but it was a really challenging time. At one point, a major incident was actually declared around the resources to manage the influx of visitors, to pull all those partners together. And actually, that's probably what you saw on the television a lot, was our leader saying, we are overwhelmed here. We are overwhelmed with, there's about 500,000 people on a 10, 12 mile stretch of beach. So that's probably the biggest thing, over and above all the other COVID stuff that everyone's been dealing with.
And what about the impact on your internal staff, Georgia? Because as I said in the introduction, you'd been quite recently through a big structural change, a local government reorganisation in your area. So your staff had already been through a change programme, and then I guess massive changes to the way people work, changes to what work people were doing. How was that internal?
Well, that's still going on, really. I mean, the council, we only had 13 months from the government making the decision that we could create the council. We only had 13 months to do it. So really, the day one, which was the 1st of April 2019, so our 1-year anniversary it didn't happen. Those plans went out the window. But our day one plan was get all the legal stuff done and make sure nothing breaks in terms of service provision. That was pretty much it, because we only had 13 months. So actually, in a way, I think it stood us in good stead, because we're still in the middle of that transformation. That transformation's just started. So becoming the new council was the start of the change that we're going through. It wasn't the end. It was the structural mechanism. Now the transformation has started, and actually it's massively accelerated a lot of the stuff that we were planning anyway, which I'm sure we've heard about loads of companies and councils decommissioning their office space, all that kind of stuff. It was always the plan, and now it's a plan that's accelerated. So I think in terms of our staff, there was already that willingness, that they're in that space already, and that probably was good in terms of being able to respond to this.
Good stuff. So Paul, we've heard from 2 kind of really on the front line in challenging situations. I know you've worked with lots of different local authorities and other organisations as well at a more strategic level. How have you found working through COVID, and what sort of challenges have you seen?
Well, in some ways I feel quite guilty sitting here, because I've spent the summer in my garden reading books and sending the occasional email and doing the odd strategy plan or whatever. So hats off to Georgia and Ben and their colleagues for the work that they're doing. I'm amazed by how well they both look this morning, because I think, Georgia, you probably had 2 hours sleep over the last 6 months, from what I can gather. And that there's sort of 2 themes already coming out, which have struck me throughout the summer when I've been working for councils. One is that however well you plan as an organisation, you can never predict, and we've never been through such an intense period of, if we're frank, chaotic delivery of stuff that we've never had to deliver before. Ben and I had a brief conversation earlier in the week, and we tried to avoid using the word unprecedented, In fact, there's been an unprecedented use of the word unprecedented over the last few months. But it is unprecedented. We haven't ever faced this before. So there's a real sense coming across from communication colleagues I work with about the intensity of the experience over the last 6 months or so. And I think there are two elephants in the room that we need to get out here quite quickly. And I could do this as somebody who's not tied to a specific council. One is about health and well-being. I know it's one of Georgia's interests as well. Local government people and local government communicators have been through a horrendous period of stress and sleeplessness and in some cases depression over the last few months, as much as the people out there in the community, and how and you're still facing the problems that you're facing right now. We're still in the middle of a crisis, so how can we support the resilience and the mental and physical well-being of our colleagues? Secondly, when we're managing change, I've had a bit of experience in communicating around change in local authorities. And usually when you manage change, to a certain extent, you've got control over your own future. You are managing it. You've decided to change and transform, and you're managing that change, and you're in control of what you do. In this case, we've been, and it may be too strong a word, a victim of somebody else's change management program. So this crisis, in a sense, has been run by the government, and local authorities have had to manage the response to decisions that they haven't necessarily been part of. So that's, I think you've got a question around, should we tear up our crisis communication Bibles? And my answer is no, but we'll come back to that. But what you never find in textbooks around change management is how to manage somebody else's change that's imposed upon you by the way that they're behaving and the way they go about things, and the good and the bad and the ugly of that. And I think we'll have to get that out in the open in this discussion without overtly criticising some brilliant, talented comms people who are in central government. Finally, there's some key themes of coming out of what I've observed and what I've worked with councils. One is nothing beats the basics. Okay, this is unprecedented, but you still need strategy and planning and insights and proper implementation, and as Ben says, evaluation and so on. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel here in terms of how you should properly communicate. We should be using good old school, old-fashioned strategic communications in the way that we've already done. And the good people like Blackburn and Bournemouth and Stoke and Birmingham and Kent and Westminster, they've kept to the basics whilst riding this wild roller coaster of an issue over the last few months. The second theme is the role of communications. It's fantastic. I'm not surprised, Lucy, that in your previous sessions and in your white paper, you've identified communications as central, but some organisations we work with haven't seen up to now the real strategic importance of communication in running their authorities and running their organisations. They have now. I would expect in Bournemouth and Blackburn, the C's part for Georgia and Ben as they walk down corridors, because they're now become really, really important people who must be at every top table. And that brings with it pressures, as we know. The third area was intensity, was an area I was going to talk about, which we talked about. Two other things. One is culture. We've a lot of transformation programs, change programs are about changing culture of the organisation. And as you say in your white paper, Lucy, there's a lot of spreadsheets and governance and theory and practice and textbooks and how to do this. But often it takes years to change an organisation, and probably longer than it needs to. COVID has shown that we can do it over a weekend. and can break down barriers and red tape and bureaucracy and all that sort of stuff, and throw the rule book out the window, and do what we need to do to get the job done. And we need to hang on to that culture change as we move into any sort of recovery. Final thing is, it's not over. This isn't over. I've worked on with some organisations around recovery plans, but they're recovering in the middle of a crisis that's still continuing. Because COVID is not going to go away. We're likely to move into a winter of discontent, as it were, with lots of stuff happening, let alone Brexit and all those other things, and flu and so on. So, as Ben said quite rightly, in the textbook in change, you go through a crisis, you manage that, you learn from it, you reassure, you recover, you reset where you are. We're trying to do that at the same time as we're still in phase one of a crisis, essentially, and that makes it really difficult.
Thank you, Paul. And finally, Helen, you made it. Welcome.
I've got a bit of a dodgy internet connection this morning, so I hope you can hear me okay.
You can do it at the moment.
Yeah, so I've been working with, it's a bit of a different context, I suppose, since last year we've been working with a hospice. So it's Ashgate Hospice Care in Chesterfield. So in terms of COVID and what changed, they had a big kind of strategic change program that was already in process, but then kind of COVID came along and everything had to change quite quickly. So all the plans and kind of comms briefings and documents and Q&As and media statements and everything that we'd spent so long planning had to suddenly be put on hold because we were in a kind of new world and everything had changed. So in terms of what happened, they quite quickly realised that they were going to have to get staff off the site, as many as possible, just to kind of protect the inpatient unit and protect patients as far as possible, because not all hospices have done this, but they made the decision to start accepting COVID patients and creating a COVID wing. So in terms of, so that made a difference, loads of things. So people who had never really remote worked before, suddenly remote working all the time. So anybody who could be off-site, who wasn't clinical, was working from home. Luckily, they'd already invested in quite good technology, so that was fortunate, because I think a lot of charities have been hit by not having made that investment, not having things like Teams that enable people to make video calls or share documents or stay in touch very easily. And one thing that Ashgate is really, really good at is being a very values-led organisation. So in terms of the culture, I think the fact that it already was, all decisions were being made in line with the charity's values, I think that definitely helped. So there was already that kind of commitment to being open, to working with compassion, to teamwork. And that really came into its own, because I think you can have as many crisis communication plans and documents and procedures in place as you like, but if the culture isn't there and maybe the trust isn't there and the kind of ethos of teamwork isn't there, then you're going to struggle. So I previously used to work at the Red Cross, so I was part of the strategy team, and I worked in quite a lot of different communications roles in the Red Cross, and including in kind of emergency response. So I think that was another thing that Ashgate were really good at, and really realised that kind of in terms of an emergency, people can kind of get that rush of adrenaline and really come together and work really, really hard, but you have to think about the long term. And I think, Paul, you mentioned that it's not over. We're still kind of, you can't really think we're massively in recovery now, because to a large extent we're still in response. We might be heading into a second wave. We don't quite know what's going to happen with flu and all of that. So it's how you look after your people while at the same time keeping everything going, responding in a way that's different to what you've had to do before. And wellbeing is something that the hospice, I mean, I guess maybe because of the nature of what they do and that kind of caring for patients all day and the compassion element, but they really took the time to put a lot of wellbeing support in place for staff. So they had wobble rooms, so where staff who were on site, so you know, if you're working in the inpatient unit and obviously dealing with quite a lot of hard situations and sometimes having to tell families, you know, restrict numbers of people who could be with their loved ones, or you're providing care but by wearing a lot of PPE, that somewhere where staff could go and have a wobble and have a moment and actually could access support. So they could speak to a trained counsellor, and if it was outside of kind of, you know, if it was like late at night on a Saturday or something, they could still pick up the phone and actually speak to someone and access kind of confidential counselling support when they needed it. But they also put in place virtual wobble rooms, so people, because obviously people have got that kind of work life, but you don't necessarily know what's going on at home and all the kind of personal issues they may be coping with, and you know, family circumstances, and perhaps like wages are down and the kids are driving them mad. So kind of that support somewhere you could maybe offload or speak to, or just kind of take a moment to get advice, proved really useful. So there's no reason why the communications team can't access that support or don't need that support as much as frontline staff. I think it's really useful, and it's kind of that one team approach where you don't just think one team's in the thick of it and dealing with everything, and don't think that everybody could be struggling at a certain point in time or might need a little bit of extra help and support. And I think that's really good. And I think it's important, especially if you work for an organisation, a health and social care organisation, or you know, where you're supposed to be caring for people, that you actually live and breathe that in terms of your own people and staff, and show that you're thinking about them and caring for them too.
Thank you, Helen. So we've got quite a few themes come out of those initial conversations. I think partnerships came up a lot of conversation around that human empathy, that well-being and support for staff, how COVID has accelerated change in some organisations. I think it's a really interesting point that Paul made about that usually you are managing a change that you are to some degree in control of, and I do think that that's been a real challenge at the moment for everybody, not just local government but for all organisations. It's been a change very much done to people, which isn't how you would want to do it normally. I am quite interested in the how, probably just because of the context of what brings me to the table is I'm a change manager, and very often when I work in organisations there isn't resource made available for comms specialists when a change programme is going on. How have you changed the way that you're communicating with your own people during this process? Have you got any learning from that perhaps, you know, 6 months ago you might have run a change programme in a certain way using certain channels and tools for communicating with staff? Is there anything that you've done differently?
I can come in a bit if you like. I think probably the boring bit is we've had really strong governance. So the process for any decisions being made, whether that is services scaling back, services scaling up, resources being deployed, has all been through a really well-defined incident management team process, which we then tap into from a comms perspective to pull out the key decisions and issues that are being considered and agreed at that meeting. So we can then take those away and make sure we are working with our staff so that staff are aware of those things, as well as translating that to the external environment. Some other things that we've done, the very wonderful Bruce Daisley has been talking about COVID being, he said, this is the time to experiment. And that phrase has rung really true with me. And we've tried, and I think it's given us the power to, yes, go through CIMT, but where we don't have to go through CIMT, the incident management team, what stuff can we just get on with? What stuff can we just do? So, for example, for our staff, we launched a closed Facebook group, because people aren't seeing each other. They're seeing each other here, but you're in MS Teams, you're having a meeting, you're going. It's almost like the virtual water cooler space. Most of our council Facebook stuff, it's cats, it's what they had for dinner, it's jokes, it's anecdotes, it's the sort of silly chat that you do have around a water cooler, or while you're waiting for the lift, or where you pass someone in a corridor. And that's totally fine. It's not meant to be a corporate communications channel. It's meant to be somewhere where people can connect with colleagues. And actually, a lot of colleagues connecting who probably don't know each other usually through the course of their business. They might be based in different places. Usually they might not work together, but they find a common interest, whether that be silly videos of cats, or growing vegetables in the garden, all that kind of stuff. So that's worked really, really well. We've got about a third of the workforce numbers is in that group, or on that platform. So that feels like it's a growing and a positive addition. We also launched our new staff support program during COVID, during lockdown, which part of obviously has got that mental health support aspect to it as well as loads and loads of other things that you'd expect from a program like that. So we're trying new things and trying to get new things out there in the best ways that we can. Yeah.
Thank you, Georgia. Ben, have you been doing anything different or new in how you communicate with your people?
Absolutely. I mean, the traditional way was you just put an article on the intranet and think, oh, job done. But with this, obviously, because there's so much change, and we've had to redeploy staff from their roles to other roles. For example, we've got the new local test and trace. So our neighbourhood teams and customer care teams have been put in there completely new to them. So I think our directors now have a better understanding of the value of keeping staff up to date, but not just thinking, I'll just put an article on the corporate channel and job done. They appreciate now that the key relationship for staff is through their managers. So we've been providing support for our managers to be better communicators. We do regular videos with the chief exec, and we do question and answer session, because 70% of our staff also live in the borough. So not only are they going through these massive changes at work, they're seeing massive changes in the community. And we want to build our staff to be advocates, because if because they live in the community, if they can give those messages out, it's a good channel for us. As I said, we try our no surprises policy. I think it's a failure if we, in normal times, if our staff read about budgets or restructures in the paper because it's been in a council report before they found out. Now that is challenging, as I said, because the way the interaction with government works is it's not always been clear what the position is, even up to the point of the announcement, you see. So, but we're just honest and transparent about that. We just say, this is the situation. It's really new to us. We're in this crisis mode, but we value you, and we will try and keep you up to date as much as possible. So I think, even though it's been really, really grim times, I do think that there has been some positives that come out of it, because, we sit in the meetings with the chief execs, the directors are at the top table. And now I think there's our chief exec's always been understanding the importance of communications, but now other directors have come on board. They know that they need to get people on board. They need to engage with people, not just because of the changes, but because of well-being as well, health and well-being. So I think, there has been some positives that have come out of this really grim process and the crisis that we've been going through.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I find quite interesting about comms is that if you look at professions where communications, it's live or die by. So people like marketing professionals, people like politicians. Lizzie, who's on the call, is our resident politician. She's a county councillor as well as working for Truman Change. And she often says in politics, it's well known that it's only when you are completely sick of saying something does it sink in for other people. Marketing professionals, there's all sorts of formulas. I think Google did some research saying, you know, there's X number of touch points that people have to see your brand, they have to interact with it, it has to be on different channels. You know, there's a process that people go through before they really understand your messaging. And yet when we are looking at internal communications, we rarely apply that level of rigor and discipline. And I think that one of the things that COVID has done is it's kind of forced organizations to stop relying on people passively receiving information and be much more proactive. And I think as well the different challenges and the fact that it's in, you know, we're all in our homes, that's reduced some of that sort of professional mask, which I know, Paul, we've spoken about. What's your view on that, Paul, as somebody that sees different organisations? Have you seen a change in becoming a bit more central and a bit more, perhaps a bit more valued, maybe?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's all 5 or 6 really positive things. COVID's been horrible and tragic and nasty, but some good things will come out of it. And I think there's probably 5 or 6 things that will, positive things will come out for communication in this, after this period. But internal communication is one of them. I mean, you know, if corporate comms was a Cinderella service within any organisation, then internal comms is a Cinderella to Cinderella, as it were. It was just the poor woman in the corner who did the newsletters and maybe wrote the blog for the chief executive. Now we're discovering, particularly with furloughed staff, and there's something like 4 out of 5 staff, local government staff nationally, are still at home, working at home, that we're going to have to take a different approach to this. And the other thing that strikes me is about culture. Lucy and I, you and I were talking about this before we started the call, that this thing we're on today has dramatically, significantly changed the culture of organisations. Because in the old days, you would call a meeting, you would go in the meeting, and there'd be several blokes, usually blokes in great Marks and Spencer suits sitting around, and the bloke at the top, or the woman at the top, was the chief exec or the senior manager and all that sort of stuff. There was clearly a hierarchy operating in terms of the dynamics of the meeting. But with this thing, you know, we're all in our studies, our kitchens, on our patios, whatever. You know, the chief exec is in his ill-advised leisure wear, sitting on the edge of his bed on his or her laptop, etc. And I think that's quite a significant cultural change. And once we've done this, even though we know we're going to have to return, if that's the right word, to some form of office-based working occasionally, we're not going to allow that hierarchy to continue and that kind of negative meeting culture to continue now that we've done this.
Thank you. So please do feel free, everyone, to put any questions that you'd like to ask the panel in the chat function. We do have a couple of questions that people submitted when they were registering to join the session. We have a question from Carol, which is asking about risk analysis and crisis plan. And did you already have, as part of your strategic planning, that kind of crisis plan in place, or was it something that you had to kind of make up as you went along a little bit? Georgia, do you mind taking that as somebody that's working directly in the front line at the moment?
Yeah, fine. That's of course. So through councils, we all have local resilience forums, and part of that is a warning and what's called a warning and informing statutory duty. Ben's nodding because he'll have that duty. All councils have that duty. So through that, there are blooming plans galore for all sorts of situations and things, you know, from oil spills to planes crashing to, you know, roads being clogged up. And probably the most relevant to this would be the planning that was done a few years ago around swine flu, which everyone thought was going to be massive and then wasn't. Now, I'm not saying we went and dusted off the swine flu plan. We didn't do that. But what we did do was have really strong relationships and governance already established, and that's been the thing that has helped carry us through, because yes, we would know who would we identify as who would lead our comms. Okay, well, this is a public health matter, therefore it will be Public Health Dorset that leads our warning and informing. They take the lead on that. There's some stuff we do at a council level about services coming up and down, and our community response and that kind of thing as well. But it doesn't sound very exciting, and it's all probably not very comsy, but actually it was about the governance that is in place that helps us to have embedded those processes for getting decisions made quickly if we need to, and also knowing what we can just get on with, because it's outside of that formal structure as well, because we talked about having to move at pace and just get on with things, and I think that structure has given us the confidence to know what we can just get on with and know where we need to get sign off and who we need to liaise with. And from a mental health and wellbeing perspective, actually that's really helped too, because if people can't cover a weekend, we say cover a weekend, none of us get paid for it, do we? In local government, it's one of those things we're just expected to do, and be on call. Well, fine, but sooner or later that takes its toll, and people need time off. So we managed to cover that through our warning and informing cell. Certainly, different colleagues would step up and say, well, I'll be the warning and informing lead this weekend, or I'll do it that weekend, so that we were making sure colleagues were getting downtime. We were looking after each other in our wider networks as well as in our own teams. I think that was really, really important.
Thank you. Ben, you were nodding your head a lot there. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think it's been covered really. As Georgia says, governance doesn't sound comsy, but it's absolutely vital, because it can lead to transparency of decision making. We have obviously our Lancashire Resilience Forum as well, and it's been great to see how all the partners have come together and really helped each other, I think. So yeah, no, absolutely agree with Georgia on all that.
Thank you. Helen, so very different type of organisation, and I imagine much smaller who you've been working with. And I know you said that some of the change and the transformation plans had to go on hold. Were there pre-existing kind of crisis plans on how to communicate in a crisis in place, or was that something that you had to create?
There were pre-existing plans in place. The chief executive of the hospice used to work at the Red Cross, so she's very good at response and recovery and all that kind of thing. But I think a lot of the plans were maybe, and we had crisis management plans in place, and I think a lot of the kind of training and background work that you do is always kind of useful. But then it was a unique situation, and what we had planned for definitely wasn't necessarily a pandemic where we had to get everybody off site straight away and start communicating in quite a different way. So there were a few things that were put in place. Internally, one of the things that's worked really well was a daily update that goes to all staff and volunteers so that they know what's happening and what the latest is, just because the situation was changing so fast in terms of number of COVID positive patients that were being cared for in the hospice and in the community, numbers of visitors that patients could receive, just where people were working, the latest advice from health on kind of infection control and social distancing, the latest, because of course they've got all the retail operation and shops and events, so all the shops had to close, so the latest on staff going on furlough, on large fundraising events being cancelled, but then different things being put in place. So kind of internally, one of the big successes was the daily update, and the just making sure people had the latest information and could always know where they could go to get it. And externally, one of the things that probably worked well was kind of a realisation, which we made really, really quickly actually, that fundraising income was going to be so massively impacted. So the hospice thinks COVID's going to cost it at least £2 million in lost income. due to events being cancelled and the retail shops being closed, and the need to try and make some of that back quite quickly. So one of the things that we worked with them on was an urgent fundraising appeal. And for that, we harnessed digital advertising in a way that the hospice had never really done before. So quite a lot of programmatic, so where people kind of clicked on the link and showed interest in the appeal, that they kind of started to see the advertising following them around and things like that, which hadn't really been done before. And it was a huge success. So it's raised over £500,000. So in terms of lost it, you know, the income that was potentially being lost, that's made a huge difference. But that was because of reacting quite fast, seeing what the context was and deciding, you know, that we had to kind of do something and take action and be proactive. And it is that thing about responding to what's going on externally. So we made the decision to, you know, it was kind of when should we press the button on the urgent appeal and when would be appropriate to do so, given that kind of some government funding was coming in. And we actually launched it when it was really, I don't know if you remember, but there was a week when kind of the problems that hospices were facing and kind of crisis in their finance was really in the news. So it was front page news, and that's when we kind of pressed the button on the urgent appeal and launched it. And in terms of look and feel, we immediately we worked on designs that made it quite clear that it was different from previous fundraising appeals and what had gone before. So it had that kind of very urgent look, you know, in terms of the brand. It looked different, it immediately grabbed your attention, so supporters could see it was something out of the ordinary. It was kind of an extraordinary response in extraordinary times. And this thing where the hospice was caring for COVID patients who were end of life in the actual community. I mean, if you're going to give to anything that's kind of local to you and is absolutely up there in terms of priority, I guess end of life patients with COVID who live near to you is probably up there. So it had that local resonance. So it worked really well. And I guess it is having that empowerment from the leadership team, that they kind of trust you to make the right decisions and try things that hadn't been tried before and see if they'll work. And in this case, you know, it's worked so well that it's kind of other fundraising appeals are all going to kind of use digital to a much greater extent than they did before, which makes a huge amount of sense, because in terms of return on investment, you can see where the money's going, and you can see if people are responding, and if they're not, we could change it daily. You know, we could place the ads or target people in a different way, so we could adapt and change and learn very quickly about what was working. Which is, you know, it's just something you can't necessarily do if you're placing print ads in the local paper.
Yeah. So I guess on the back of that, so we're already thinking of ways that will work differently going forward. This is certainly for all of the panel members, anybody that wants to answer it. If you were in charge of designing some sort of leadership program for the next generation of comms specialists, what learning would you bring from your experience of working through COVID? What skills and what learning do you think it's really important that we pass on to the next generation of people who'll be leading comms during times like this? Paul, do you want to?
I'll jump in. There are several things. I mean, I wish I was a member of the new generation coming up, because I think people like Georgia and Ben and others have created such a different basis on which they can have some really interesting and exciting careers. But I think there's learning around the importance of collaboration and partnerships and breaking down cultures between organisations and barriers and so on. We can't go back to the I'm going to protect my area kind of approach to partnership working. I think there's some real lessons around engagement, that however brilliant we might think Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and Instagram and all those sorts of things are in terms of creating conversations, sometimes hitting the streets and engaging directly with your audience is really important. And some of the interesting stuff is quite old school stuff about going back to the old days in terms of printing leaflets and knocking on doors, and all that sort, and creating relationships in communities and all that sort of stuff. In local government, nobody so far has mentioned, once or twice mentioned politicians or councillors. And as Lizzie will know, I think in many ways, councillors and that political connection and that democratic connection has re-emerged as important, because those councillors, for all their strengths and some of their weaknesses, are in touch with their local communities, are an important channel of communication both ways and engagement. So any new member of staff needs, whether they like politics or not, needs to engage in the political and democratic life of their organisation. And then the final thing is that we just talked about risk, and as Georgia outlined, local authorities are really good at risk management and risk registers and all that sort of stuff. They're not so good at taking risks. So the stereotype is risk averse, isn't it? We've all started taking risks and we've made some mistakes, but so what? You know, we've made it up as we went along, and we cut through the red tape. So new members of staff we need to bring people on who don't follow the rules. It's a bit like Dominic Cummings' weirdos, isn't it? We need to bring some weirdos into local government, perhaps not quite as weird as some of the people he's brought in, but to change the culture of the organisation. Take some blooming risks and don't go back to endless meetings and plans or whatever. Just do some stuff.
Thank you. Georgia, do you want to add anything? What do you think we need to be teaching people?
Not a massive amount to add. I totally agree with everything that Paul said there. I think one of the things I would encourage people to push for, which sometimes gets lost in the everything's urgent, everything's important world, which even pre-COVID, is actually one thing is having that clarity of outcome. You know, quite often our internal colleagues, they want to communicate for communication's sake. They don't know what they want to achieve. I want awareness. You know, how often do we hear that? I want awareness. Why do you want awareness? You must want something other than people to know about this thing. And the good thing with COVID is absolute clarity of purpose. It's about saving people's lives, stopping the virus spreading, protecting people. That's it. And I think that in a way that everyone gets that, everyone unites behind that, and that need for clarity of purpose, it helps with everything. It helps with your messaging, it helps with your evaluation, it helps with your call to action. So I would say pushing and being braver around not rolling over when people have not got a clarity of outcome, because I'm guilty of charged on that sometimes. Sometimes it's easier to just get on with things, and I would say be brave and push for that clarity of outcome.
Yeah, and as a change manager, that's definitely music to my ears, because again, in change programs, often people talk about, well, these are our milestones, and I'm like, why would your staff care that? Tell them what will be different, tell them what they care about, tell them what change they need to make, not who's on your board and when decisions are being made. No one's bothered. And I think there's a real art to not just communicating from your own perspective, and I think that comms people have a real role to play in being brave with that and saying, yeah, but no one cares. Tell people what they care about and why they need to care about it.
Funnily enough, the other thing I wrote down was personas and empathy. Not coming, it's very easy to come at everything from the perspective of your organisation, because that's who you work for. That's not necessarily an odd thing to do, but actually we don't exist for our organisations, we exist for people. People live here. That's why local authorities exist. And developing those personas and having empathy with the different types of people and residents and audiences that we are supporting. What do they need from us? What do they need from the organisation? And pushing that back and making sure that we're that bridge between the corporate and the non-corporate, I guess.
The one thing I would like to add to all that, because I completely agree with Paul's point about people having political nous, and that's not just in terms of communicators as well. I know directors, not at Blackburn with Darwin, but elsewhere, who don't seem to have any political nous or understanding of counsellors at all. But I think there's also a role for people to learn to use data, especially now. We have to be data driven and intel driven, and sometimes, and I've been guilty of this a lot, when you get public health data and you have to try and translate that into something meaningful, is very, very challenging, but it's so important. So there's always been a debate about communications. Is it a science or is it an art? I think it's probably a mixture, but as COVID has shown, you need the intel, you need the research, and you need the data to properly inform your decision making and your content and your messages, especially as we move to hyperlocal. So you need to understand that community, you need to understand what that community is telling you, and you need to understand what the data is telling you as well. And finally, the other point is always be value driven. Lucy, I've got very, very strong principles, and I try in all senses to try and keep true to them. And I think that's really important, especially when we talk about being empathetic, especially, and kind as well. So yeah, those are the three things I would like to add to that.
Thank you, Ben. Helen, what would you like to add? What would you train future comms leaders in?
I think the data thing is a really good point, but I'd also say, the basics work, the kind of communications basics don't always have to be rushing to the new thing. You can have all the kind of TikToks that you like, but in the end, kind of clear, simple, concise messaging, making sure you're reaching your target audiences in a way that makes sense to them, having your statements prepared, briefing your spokespeople properly, all the kind of things that you do just as part of the day job still matter. In fact, all the kind of training and preparation and background work that you've done comes into its own. So there's nothing beats kind of a basic good news sense and grounding in communications and writing well, and definitely understanding what outcome you want to achieve as well. Don't just kind of dive in without understanding where you're going with it.
Thank you. And what about because obviously, as well as your work with the hospice, you have a PR agency, and there's been lots of very interesting PR situations throughout the course of COVID. And I said at the start of the call, yesterday's was all over Twitter, the Dettol campaign, trying to get people to feel all warm and fuzzy about going back to work. And it feels like there's been quite a few incidences where organisations or companies have got it really right and got it really wrong. Is there any learning from kind of the PR side of external comms during a crisis?
I think what's been really interesting, and be interesting to hear the type of people working in local government, is just how much national government seems to be getting wrong or having to backtrack on, which is in no way a reflection of, I'm sure, what's a very able communications teams that they've got, but in the end, a kind of decision, you've got to go with the decision makers and the decisions that they might be making, and that's, I guess, because I used to work at the Red Cross, and you do have your kind of command and control structures and your LRFs and plans, and who's responsible for what. But what seems to be happening nationally is those plans almost seem to be going out the window, or we'll try something else and see if that works. And maybe that's what we're seeing with track and trace and things, that maybe local public health officials are not being listened to. And I think that whole kind of dynamic is interesting, because you might have your procedures and your plans, but then it's that thing about externally to you, people are making decisions that might not make any sense, but then you've got to respond and react. So I'd be interested to hear kind of what's happened there and how that kind of relationship has gone.
Paul, do you want to take that as the person that's comfortable being independent?
Yeah, have you got 3.5 hours left on the clock? I think, well, the only thing I'll say very quickly is that I think the government really started well, actually. I mean, they had a very simple message, which is blooming stay at home and keep your head down and let's protect the NHS and let's save lives and all that sort of stuff. And I thought in the early days, the press conferences worked and it was giving information and there was a lot of credibility for the two medical experts and scientists, etc. And then slowly but surely, as it's become much more difficult, the communication has become, from sort of okay to potentially quite disastrous. Because in a paradoxical way, they've turned the communication exercise into a PR exercise. So a lot of the communication now is about defending a position as opposed to giving people the information, the honest, open, transparent information they need to have in order to save their own lives in that sense. And all this talking things up is just defeatist, is defeating ultimately. The track and testing is not world beating. So admit that and tell us what you're going to do about it. And tell us what we can do about it to behave differently and all that sort of stuff. But trying to pretend it's all going well, I think, is ridiculous, really. And my guess is, interesting enough, I haven't heard much from any people like George and I have got a lot of good contacts in government communications on the civil service side. They've been very, very quiet, those people, because my guess is they've been giving the advice or their advice is being ignored and they're not in control. Their destiny as communicators. And once this is all over, as part of the reorganisation of government communication services, a lot of those really good colleagues, I think, are going to be looking for other work because they can't put up with what they've had to put up with over the last few months or whatever. Yeah. But, to be fair to everybody, this is a major crisis times a million, isn't it? And it's global and it's chaotic and it's a novel coronavirus. So no one's ever done this before. So we're all going to make mistakes. Some of us have just made a few more mistakes than others.
I think that's a massively good point that you said, that they've kind of turned what should be a communications exercise into a PR and kind of campaigning exercise. And that's maybe where the problems are coming from. I think that really resonates. And it's worrying as we head into Brexit that if they try and do the same thing and kind of approach it on a kind of campaigning footing rather than a kind of information, this is what is happening, this is what we're doing about footing, that's when, the wheels will start falling off. So hopefully there'll be some learnings from kind of what's happening at the moment that they might take forward into kind of Brexit and what's happening, once we reach the end of the year. I think that's an excellent point.
Thank you. We have had a question from a lady called Louise who wasn't actually able to join the call in the end, but she submitted the question. It's a really good question, so I do want to pose it. And that was, is there anything in our crisis comms planning Bibles that we should rip up and rewrite as a result of COVID? And I'm interested to hear the answer to this, because actually a lot of what the panel have said so far is kind of doing the basics right and it's almost reinforced some aspects of it. But is there any aspects of comms planning, crisis planning that you would start again with, that you would change? Anybody want to take that?
Just to dive in really quickly, I'm not on commission, but some of us will know. Is the writing the right way around at your end? Some of us will know Amanda Coleman, who worked until recently for Manchester Police and was right literally in the centre of things when the Manchester bombing happened a couple of years back and so on. And she's written this book, Crisis Communication Strategies. I'm sure she was definitely writing it before COVID happened, but it came out as COVID started to hit us. And that goes through what you would call the basics. And rereading this very quickly over the last couple of days, I don't think the basics have changed. She says it's about people, planning, preparing, process and purpose, and all those things Helen and Ben and Georgia have tackled as part of their debate this morning. The only thing that strikes me is that Amanda, because she's an optimist, presumes you can control things. And there's a lot about controlling and being in charge and being on the front foot and whatever. I think there probably is a new chapter she has to write about COVID, because how do you control chaos? How do you control something you've never come across before? How do you control communication and crisis response when you're reacting to somebody's potentially poor management of that response, and so on and so forth? But I think Helen's exactly right. Stick to the blooming basics. It always works.
Georgia, do you have anything to add? Anything that you've learned that you would not take forward?
Not necessarily that I wouldn't take forward, but maybe that I would add. And I think Ben mentioned it right at the outset, really, which is we usually assume that crises are relatively short-lived and quite linear. You know, something happens, we respond to it, we recover from it, we move on. You know, that's not, we know from this that is not the case. It's so much more nuanced than I think any of the plans generally take in account. So I think it's that nuanced thing and the fact that you can go back as well as forward in a way. You know, we're all waiting to see about winter peaks. Obviously Ben's going through that anyway with local issues where he is. So I think that really would be one of the key things that I would say is don't assume it's that linear process.
I think that's a really good point, and something I certainly see in organisations is just fatigue. You know, I'm working with councils that are mandating that everybody had to take some leave in August because they're worried about what's going to happen in autumn and winter, but also fatigue in the community. So I think at the start of the process, there was a very British, we're all going to pull together and people are going to volunteer to deliver medicines to shielding people, and there was a real sense of pulling together. And now, certainly where I live, I'm not seeing that as strong, and if anything I'm seeing sort of divides in the community because people just don't have the resilience to carry on living in this crisis mode for such a long time. And so I think you're right, we do always assume that a crisis is something big that happens that we then heal from, and we're still very much in it happening. Ben, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would. I mean, the only thing that I think has changed for us is media management. So in a crisis, you know, when you're responding to it, you should, you know, when the media requests, get on the front foot and, you know, try and do as many as possible. For example, when Alton Towers had that terrible incident a few years ago, you know, the chief exec was straight on the scene and doing interview after interview to give people reassurance and just being quite human and saying, you know, we've had this incident and but because of the nature of COVID, it's been unsustainable. We've had to decline interviews for spokespeople. They wanted spokespeople because they couldn't physically do it anymore, because once we became an area of intervention, the country's attention turned onto us. So we were having requests from every national newspaper, every national broadcaster, every national radio station every 5 minutes. So we took a very we changed our media handle and said, right, we're not going to do. I mean, we even had the New York Times when we did the local trace. So we took the decision to say we're going to politely decline all those, you know, and concentrate on our local media because our primary purpose is serving our residents. Now, as I said, in terms of crisis communications, that's probably a no-no. You don't no comment or whatever to people, but we just couldn't do it. You know, we had four major spokespeople, and they literally couldn't do it anymore. So I think that's the one thing we've changed. And I think the other thing is contained in the sort of crisis communications theory, is getting on the front with myths and disinformation, which has become a huge issue in terms of COVID. I mean, one of the myths that are going around, especially in our area, because our strategy, as is the government, is test. But people have come back and said, if you test more, our cases are going to go up and we're going to end up like Leicester and we're going to have full lockdown. So you have to tackle those, and you have to put resource in actually finding those myths and different information and give the information correctly. So that was all I wanted to add, other than the fact that, yeah, absolutely, do the basics right.
I think that's a really good point, Ben. You know, that it's so easy for people to express opinions which very quickly get traction because of social media, and I certainly see that myself online with all sorts of issues around masks and around testing, as you say, and where the hotspots are, and there is a lot of misinformation, and I think that's definitely a problem of our time in lots of ways, not just COVID. Helen, do you have anything to add? Is there anything that you think we should rip up out of the Bible, or is there anything you think we should add?
I think probably, I don't know, maybe I'm just thinking about like the really detailed planning where you plan and finesse everything to the nth degree, presuming that you're going to be in complete control of everything. Because, you know, for any crisis situation or actually any change, what's always going to happen is things that are going to come up that you didn't expect, or the external context is going to change. So you need that kind of fluidity and ability to change and respond and react. And maybe that's one thing that communicators of the future, is what you definitely be looking for in your team, is that kind of awareness of the external context and the news agenda, and then you're not operating in a organisational vacuum where you have control of everything and you decide what the messages are and then they get relayed perfectly as you would want them to be. You have to be able to change and adapt and find out what's going on and hear from the ground what's actually happening. So yeah, maybe I don't know how much traction that would have, saying I'm not going to finesse these plans to the nth degree, because it might not actually be all that useful. But yeah, maybe having shorter plans where there's more scope for you to respond might be a good idea.
Yeah. That's certainly something that came up in other conversations we've been having, not just around comms, but general project management and change management and making things happen. It has been that, you know, have some plan and have a structure to how you're approaching things, but perhaps in the past we have spent too long making it perfect. And I guess that comes back to Paul's earlier comments about, you know, appetite for risk, and sometimes you've just got to try something and see how it goes rather than getting a detailed plan in place. We've just got a couple of minutes left. Is there any final thoughts from any of the panel members? Any last kind of bits of wisdom to share?
Yeah, definitely. If I go first, I think two final points from me, which ties in to the sort of well-being aspects. Communicators as professionals are all, I think, you know, perfectionists a lot of the way. They want absolutely everything to be right, myself included, but you can't be perfect in this situation. You're going to make mistakes, and it's how you respond to those mistakes. And also, I think we need to be kind to ourselves as well. As you know, Lucy, I like a football analogy. I think you need to rotate your team, you need to rest your players, and otherwise you end up on the treatment table. So the health and well-being aspects of this for communicators is really, really important. But the positive thing, I think, is that people have really seen the value of good communications, because this crisis has all been about information, communicating with your communities, and so it's really good to see that we're valued.
Thank you, Ben. Paul, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I'm just going to pick up on Ben's value point, actually, because I think that's a really important one. Some of you will know Alex Aitken, who is Director of Government Communication Services, and he once said to a meeting I was part of that communication is a noble profession. During the last 6 months, Georgia and Ben and Helen and others have saved lives. So it goes back to Georgia's point about this is about the people of Bournemouth and the people of Blackburn and so on and so forth. We're doing really important work. So I felt when I was going on that doorstep to clap key workers, that included, the press officer of my local council. We're doing really important work. We work in a noble profession. We are protecting and saving people's lives, and we should always remember that, whatever nonsense we occasionally get from our colleagues who think they know better than we do about how to communicate effectively in these sort of situations.
Thank you, Paul. Georgia, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Thank you. Just a few nuggets, I guess. I suppose one of the biggie is, let's not forget the scope for real behaviour change that COVID is presenting to us around things like environmental sustainability, active travel, community relations, and a community sense of community that this is bringing. So that kind of legacy work that as cases rise, and it's easy to lose sight of that, but there's real scope for long-term positive behaviour change here. Probably a couple of other things is around Paul's point around saving lives. A previous service director who's not long since departed, but has departed, was always very critical of central services. He didn't like his recharges, all these overheads, you could get it cheaper elsewhere, etc., etc. And he once said to me, Georgia, what your team does, you're not a back office function, you are a frontline service. And I've always carried that as a massive positive and compliment. And the last thing, I can't let the mental health line go without mentioning Comms Unplugged. It's a join our community, follow us on Twitter. It's an event that isn't taking place this year because it would be next week, but it's a health and wellbeing and a learning and development event and community for communications professionals. It's a little bit different. It takes you off the socials and it takes you away from your work email, because it takes place in Marquees, in a field, in Dorset. It's amazing. I can see Josephine and is on the line, and Carol. They're part of our Unplugger community, advocate for us, bless them all the time. So please join us. We're very, very strong on mental health support throughout the year, not just at our event. So maybe we'll see you in the field next year.
Thank you, Georgia. And we will be sending out an email to everyone asking for some feedback. So if you want to send me some details, I'll make sure that goes on the email to everybody so that they can access that. Helen, is there any last thoughts from you?
No, I think, just that thing about collaborating and learning, and even if you're in the midst of a crisis that's going on, take the time to understand what other organisations and people are doing and how they're tackling things, because there's not just one right way of doing things, and I guess you can definitely learn from what other people are doing. So I think that kind of plug for Comms Unplugged is a really good and well made one, and it's important to take the time out to make sure you're kind of learning from other people.
Thank you. So we are out of time. It's been fascinating for me as a non-comms professional to listen to you all, so thank you so much. I think we've learned lots about collaboration, about and probably a deeper understanding, certainly for non-comms people like myself, of some of the challenges that you guys have been facing recently. I think what's really shone out to me is the well-being side has come up time and time again, and also that stick to the basics but be flexible. I feel like if I had to sum up the lessons, that probably is it. Huge thank you to everybody for dialing in. We would love to keep in touch with you. We're on a mission to make change better and to help organisations to do it well. So we'd love to keep in touch with you. We will be sending a feedback form out, which I will put some information on about Georgia's Comms Unplugged. We're running these events, I think they're every 3 weeks between now and sort of Christmas. They each have a different theme. The next theme is people impact. So we've got some really good HR and OD people on that one. And so if you have a look at our website, truemanchange.co.uk/events, you'll be able to see which ones we've got booked there. Please do let us know as well if you know somebody who you think would be a great panel member. We're always open to meeting new people and involving lots of people in the process. And we did write a white paper, which I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, which was really just a summary of all the lessons from the last round of change chats that we did, and that is available on our website, which is truemanchange.co.uk. But please do keep in touch with us, follow us on social media, and we hope to see you at future events. And thank you so much to our speakers for your time.